Hey, church, welcome to week 15 of our chronological Bible reading. I am covering April 9th through the 15th, which is found in 1 Samuel 1 through 1 Samuel 21. So this week, we ended the Judges era and we moved into the Kingdom era. Now, we haven't spent a whole lot of time talking about the different eras, but they really are a very helpful tool to give you a very high level view of the entire story of the Bible. So, just as a really quick review, we started with the creation era back in January. And in the creation era, we had the stories of Adam and Eve, the fall, Cain and Abel, the flood, the Tower of Babel. So from the Tower of Babel, the people are scattered, and we move into the patriarch era, where we learn the stories of Abraham, of Isaac, and Jacob. And it's really in this era that God, or it's not really, it is in this era, that God promises Abraham to make him into a great nation, and that all the nations on earth will be blessed through him. And so this is a promise that's pointing to Jesus, because Jesus comes through the lineage of Abraham, and you can see that if you go and you look in the Gospel of Matthew. But one of the things that I like to say is that in the Old Testament, every story whispers his name. Actually, Sally Lloyd-Jones said that, and I just like to quote her. But here we see how the stories of the Bible are pointing to the coming of Jesus. And so from the patriarch era, we move into the Exodus era. So here we see God freeing the Israelites from the Egyptians. They begin their move to the promised land. God gives Moses the law, and he teaches the law to the people. And then from there, we see after Moses' death, Joshua is given the task of leading the people into the promised land in the conquest era. So Joshua takes them across. He goes through an entire review of the law that Moses gave them, and then they are able to go in and they conquer the land, and they divide it among the 12 tribes. And then after Joshua's death, the people, they fail to follow the Lord, and they enter into a period of 7 sin cycles in which they sin. God sends them an oppressor. They cry out to God. He delivers them through a judge, and then they experience this time of peace until the judge dies, and they go back to living for themselves and not for God. And so this is where we pick up in this week's reading. We've just finished the Judges era, and we've moved into the Kingdom era. And so what we see at the end of the Judges era is that Israel really has a deep need for a true leader. So when we enter the Kingdom era, we see that they want to solve this problem, and they're trying to solve it by asking for a human king. And it's not because they want to be godly, but it's because they want to be like the nations around them. They aren't content to be God's set apart people. And I think what we can learn from this is that as we read, it's very easy for us to look at them and go, what was their problem? God was faithful to them. Why couldn't they just obey and just trust? But I think if we're honest with ourselves, we can ask ourselves the same question. And I think that we're going to find that we are much more like the Israelites in wanting to be like the people around us instead of being a set apart people than we'd like to admit. But getting into this week's content, or this week's reading, there was a lot of content there. But what really stood out to me, I think, is the contrast between Saul and David. So in 1 Samuel 9:2, Saul is described, he's described as tall and handsome. He's the kind of king that people would naturally want. David, on the other hand, was a shepherd boy. And when Samuel goes to anoint David as king, even Samuel's impressed by David's older brother. And he goes through all the brothers before he's like, God says he's not here. And David's own father doesn't even bring him in from the field at first. But God says, man looks at the outward appearance. The Lord looks at the heart. God is not like us, and his thoughts are not our thoughts. And God has the power to develop anybody that he chooses into the kind of leader that he desires. And so that's what we see in David. David was a ruddy shepherd boy. He learned to trust God while tending sheep in his father's field. He fought lions and bears while shepherding. So when he goes to see his brothers in the battle against the Philistines, when they're about to fight, Goliath is taunting them, he sees Israel paralyzed by Goliath. And he sees Saul, their king, unable to act. He's paralyzed in fear as well. And so David gets there, and he's not afraid. David's angry. And so in 1 Samuel 17:26, David asks, who is this pagan Philistine anyway, that he is allowed to defy the armies of the living God? And then before the battle, David even says to Goliath, he says, you come to me with sword, spear, and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of heaven's armies. And then he says, later on, he says, this is the Lord's battle, and he will give you to us. And so that's the difference. Saul saw a giant. David saw God. And David, who was the unlikely warrior, he became Israel's champion. He stepped in as a representative for the people, and he won the battle that they couldn't fight on their own. And in that way, he points us to Jesus. Jesus is a true and better king. Jesus defies our greatest enemies for us. And so Saul looked at what was in front of him, the people that were in front of him, and he was paralyzed by fear. David looked at a God who had been faithful, and the Lord used him to win the battle. So my encouragement to you this week is this. What are you fixing your eyes on that has you paralyzed with fear? And then where has God already shown you his faithfulness so that you can trust him as you move forward in whatever situation that you're facing? So if you have continued your reading, you're up to date on your reading, you are doing such a great job. And I promise you that God will reward your faithfulness to read his word. So keep going, even when it feels hard, even when it feels tedious. And we will see you Sunday.